The Arkansas Historic Preservation Program presents Arkansas's Haunted Historic Houses. Ghost stories are a kind of folklore that assumes the reader or listener believes in ghosts and includes a ghost or haunting as part of the story's action or plot. There are dozens of ghostly folk tales about historic houses in Arkansas. Let's take a look at 5 of them. The Hornibrook House is one of the most magnificent Victorian houses in the state. It's located in the capital, Little Rock. The builder of the Hornibrook House, James H. Hornibrook, was born in Toronto, Canada in 1840. He moved to Little Rock in 1867, where he opened a liquor distributorship and saloon. By the 1880s, James Hornibrook was a wealthy man. In 1888, he hired 2 architects to design a residence that reflected his wealth. The architects were Max A. Orlop Jr. and Caspar Kuzner. The house cost $20,000 to build in 1888. That would be roughly $5 million today. The house was called one of the finest residences in the state by the Arkansas Gazette. It had steam heat, plumbing, a beautiful skylight, and a turret room surrounded by stained glass. When Mr. Hornibrook's daughter, Leslie, was married in the house in September of 1889, the Arkansas Gazette described it as large and elegant, being furnished with everything that wealth and artistic taste could suggest. Mr. Hornibrook enjoyed gambling and reportedly held an ongoing illegal card game in the turret room. Reportedly, Mr. Hornibrook hired a young boy to climb up into the area above the room and keep an eye out for the police. Sadly, Mr. Hornibrook was only able to enjoy his beautiful house for 2 years. On May 24, 1890, he returned home from his saloon around 3 a.m. Just after he entered the front gate of the home, he had an apoplectic stroke. This could have been a stroke, an aneurysm, or a heart attack. Mr. Hornibrook struck his head on the pavement and died. He lay there 3 hours before a local butcher boy alerted someone. James H. Hornibrook was 49 years old. Mr. Hornibrook was buried in Mount Holly Cemetery, the oldest public cemetery in Little Rock. His house, however, continued to have a long and interesting life. The house stayed in the family until 1897. Over the years, it was a women's college, a private home, a nursing home, and a home for disabled adults. Since Bob and Sharon Blair moved into the Hornibrook house in 1995, there have been several reports of ghosts in the home.
The first experience that we probably had in the Hornibrook house was during the restoration. My husband and I went upstairs and we were just kind of checking out what the workmen had done for the day. Very excited, of course, to see things beginning to progress. And I was standing in the threshold of one of the bedrooms, and my husband was in the upstairs hall. And he turned around, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. And as he looked around, he saw this image of a very dapperly dressed man in a Homburg hat descending the stairwell. And he glanced over at Bob, and they kind of made eye contact. And Bob's just kind of standing there, and he turns to say, "Sharon," and when he turned back, he was gone. And so that was the first time that he knew that maybe there were some other folks living at our house. Several months later, and this was in the middle of the hot summer, July, and the doors had been taken off of the front entrance. We were downstairs, and he kind of came down the stairwell walking towards the front doors, which were all covered up with plastic. And this cold, icy breeze just went by him. And he immediately had the feeling that it was the same gentleman. There was no visual or anything like that. And it only lasted a couple instances, but he just had the feeling it was like, and he somehow felt it might have been Mr. Hornibrook. So after that then, we had a gentleman who was coming back to do some touch-ups. This gentleman was going upstairs to the card room, and he was working on some trim work in there, doing some finishing touch-up, staining, etc. And so he left something outside of the card room, and so he had to come downstairs. and he just left the door open. Well, when he came back, the door was closed, and he tried to open it, and it was locked. And he couldn't figure out what was going on because there wasn't a key for it. It had never been locked before. So he came back downstairs then to ask Bob, well, you know, does that door lock, you know, maybe the wind or something, you know, the windows weren't open, but maybe somehow it just closed and locked. And Bob said, well, no, that door doesn't lock. There's not a key for it. And they went back upstairs and the door was open again. And the guy just kind of came unglued and said, I'm not working up here, and left.
The Clayton house's story is all about the Wild Wild West. During the Civil War, Arkansas was overrun with guerrilla soldiers. What's a guerrilla soldier? Someone who fights warfare off the battlefield. Some guerrillas weren't even fighting for an army. They took advantage of the chaotic wartime to get away with crime. One such soldier in Arkansas was Doc Rayburn, who terrorized Prairie and White counties during the Civil War. After the war, many people were homeless, hungry, and angry. Some were bitter about their experiences. Some of the young soldiers, used to killing and looting, did not want to go back to normal life. They started robbing stagecoaches, trains, banks, and stores, stealing horses and cattle, and murdering anyone who resisted. Many wanted to get even with the North, which justified their thefts of Northern-owned banks and trains. Many of these outlaws began hiding out in Indian territory because it was easy to evade the law there. The old military fort in Fort Smith was converted to a courthouse in 1872 to try criminals and outlaws from the Indian Territory. This was the only federal court in Fort Smith. Between 1872 and 1875, the court was overseen by Judge William Story, who resigned in 1874 because of allegations that he was corrupt. Judge Isaac C. Parker was appointed in his place. William H. Clayton, the owner of the Clayton House, was the prosecuting attorney in his court. Together, they oversaw thousands of cases and convictions. William H. Clayton was born in Pennsylvania and fought for the Union during the Civil War. After the war, he moved with two of his brothers to Arkansas and began a career in the law. In 1874, he was appointed to federal prosecutor for the Western District of Arkansas. William Clayton's brothers had a big impact on their adopted state. Powell Clayton became the 9th governor of Arkansas from 1868 to 1871, during a time when there was a lot of violence and unrest. John Clayton, William Clayton's twin brother, stayed in Jefferson County to oversee the large farm the brothers bought there, but he also worked as a state senator and sheriff of Jefferson County for 7 years. In 1889, John Clayton was asked to go to Conway County to investigate a missing ballot box. While there, he was murdered. The crime was never solved. The Clayton House was built in 1852 by a Mr. Sutton, who left during the Civil War.
The Clayton House was built in 1852, and it was built by a Southern businessman. He was a wealthy merchant that came here and benefited from Fort Smith being the gateway to the West, with so many people traveling through here on their way westward. And he had a thriving business on our main street. He had slaves. We have a record of that. So that was built, he built it in 1852 and left when the Civil War was going on. That was when the Union Army marched in 1863, and he was on the Confederate side, so he and his family fled to Texas. And when they came back, they learned that this home was being used as a Civil War hospital, treating ill and wounded soldiers. He did get his home back and tried to make it, but ultimately really could not regain his wealth after the Civil War. And the next person to buy the home after it had been vacant for a while was the prosecutor of Judge Parker's court, and that was William Henry Harrison Clayton. And that's why it's called the Clayton House today. He doubled the home in size in 1882 when he moved in, and raised 6 girls and 1 son here with his Southern Belle wife. And each day he would leave this home in his top hat and frock coat and walking stick and get in his carriage and head down to the court and work with Judge Parker, the hanging judge, prosecuting people for all kinds of crimes in Indian Territory, which had really attracted all the outlaws from our whole country after the Civil War. It was a place where they could run home free, pretty much. There wasn't a lot of law there. Well, they left in 1897, and another chapter began with the house, but it became a boarding house, and that was around 1906. And from 1906 all the way through the 1960s, different people lived in every single room except for the dining room where they ate. And our stories about the paranormal have come mainly from people who have worked here and some guests. And what we've done is realize, after comparing different people's stories about what they saw, that the Clayton house has 3 resident ghosts. The first we call the tall, angry man. He is tall and he's wearing black. He looks very angry in the face. He has some kind of hat on. It could be a top hat, a military uniform, and stalks angrily. The last person that saw that was a new board member who was helping us one night, actually, as we held some paranormal tours. And he was sitting on the front porch to greet people when they came, and he saw a man in costume peek his head around the corner of the house and stare, and he got up because he thought that person was just dressed for Halloween and needed help knowing where to go to come to our tour. And when he went, he realized the man had disappeared and was nowhere in sight. And then he described it, and it was the exact description of the tall, angry man. The second is the woman in the brown dress. We've kind of named them with Monet titles. And she stands still and is very peaceful. She has gray hair and it's pulled back in a bun, and she's been seen by different people. It could be Mrs. Clayton. It could be Emma High, who owned it as a boarding house. Maybe a nurse from the Civil War times, who knows. The third is the most interesting and has been spotted the most. It's a gray cat. The gray cat can be seen darting across the floors. Now we've had several paranormal investigations, and none of them have been fruitless, so to speak. Every single paranormal investigation has reported back that they have EVPs, or some kind of activity on the camera that they weren't able to see or hear while they were here.
The chaos of the Civil War stopped the development of rail travel in Arkansas for many years. By the 1870s and 1880s, trains had become extremely important to the state's economy. The story of the Rush Gates house wouldn't exist without the trains that came through Forest City in St. Francis County. The Memphis to Little Rock Railroad was the first railroad built in Arkansas. The building started before the Civil War, but was interrupted during the conflict. After the war, the state and contractors were eager to finish the line. In 1866, Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest was awarded a contract to build the Memphis and Little Rock line over Crowley's Ridge. He established a commissary at the site of present-day Forest City. 3 years later, that commissary had become a town. In 1900, Dr. James Odie Rush moved to Forest City to become a doctor for the railroad. In 1906, he built a 7,000 square foot house immediately across from the tracks. He used it as his office and home for the next 60 years. Dr. Rush was not just a medical doctor, he also acted as a dentist and undertaker for the community. He treated hundreds of railroad workers on-the-job injuries and illnesses. It is reasonable to assume that some people died in the home over the years. Dr. Rush was a country doctor, which meant that many of his patients couldn't pay him with cash. One day, he noticed some pottery in the yard of a patient and said that he would take that for payment. The pottery turned out to be important archaeological artifacts from the many Mississippian Native American sites in St. Francis County. Over the years, people gave him more and more artifacts. Eventually, his collection grew to more than 3,700 items, including some very rare pieces. This includes a head pot and the Crow Creek mastodon, that was dug up by city workers in 1949 and given to Dr. Rush. In 1995, the Rush family turned over the house to the next door church, who then donated it to the county. It is now the St. Francis County Museum, where you can go to learn about the history of St. Francis County and see Dr. Rush's extensive artifact collection.
And I was going to tell you a few of the stories that I have of the paranormal activity that I've witnessed myself. Now, there are a lot of stories, but these are just ones I rely on what I know myself. The very first paranormal group that came in to do a study here, they came in and they set up recorders, and they had video cameras, they had recorders, they had all kinds of equipment. Apparently they could not keep their equipment charged. Their batteries kept going dead. They kept bringing out, they had boxes of new batteries, they kept putting new batteries in, and the batteries did go dead constantly. They did record two voices. One voice was recorded in the artifact room, and they were asking the question, do you have something to say? Will you please talk to me? This was the paranormal investigators were asking the house. If you have something to say, we would like to hear it. Will you speak to us? And just almost as plain as day, all they did was turn it up loud. You could hear a reply that said, you won't listen to me. They did say that they also recorded the voice of a child upstairs, and I don't know about that. It sounded like a giggle or a laugh, but it was a little scary to me, so I didn't go into that one. But that's about all they got out of that first investigation. They haven't been back. I've not ever heard from them again. So far, since I've been here, we've had 3 haunted houses, and each year we have disturbed whoever else lives here in the house. Now, the first year we had quite a few volunteers who were running around screaming and laughing, and we were taking kids up the elevator to the upstairs. Some of our volunteers came outside. I was outside tending to the door, and told me that there was a man standing in front of the door and would not let them on the elevator. I came in and I really did not see a man, but we had strobe lights, we had a fog machine, so it was very, very obscured. But as soon as everybody went back out, they said it was a dark shadow of a man, and that he was very tall, and they felt very menacing. Or green and blue orbs, large orbs that would go up and down the hallway that night. And I don't know if it was the screaming or the laughing, the running, the banging that the kids were doing, but it was quite uneasy that night.
One of the most prominent early residents of Bentonville after the Civil War was Colonel Samuel West Peel. He started a career in government as the Carroll County clerk during the early days of the war. Samuel Peel fought for the Confederates in the Battle of Wilson's Creek and the Battle of Prairie Grove. After the war, Mr. Peel studied law and moved to Bentonville, where he worked as a prosecuting attorney. In 1882, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He was the first native-born Arkansan to get a seat in Congress. Mr. Peel belonged to a politically powerful family. His wife, Mary Berry, was sister to James Henderson Berry, the 14th governor of Arkansas. After Mr. Peel left Congress, he worked as the attorney for Native Americans in Indian Territory. He lived in Bentonville for the rest of his life and raised several children in the Peel Mansion. The Peel Mansion was saved from destruction and is now a museum that you can visit. The museum features a number of rare artifacts that belong to the Peel family and includes living history presentations by talented historians and actors. One of the ghosts seen in the house is the White Lady. A woman in a white dress has been seen coming down the main stairway by many visitors and workers. Another ghost encountered is Minnie Bell, the daughter of Samuel W. Peel and Mary Berry. She is thought to be responsible for the piano in the women's parlor that is often heard playing when no one is in the building. Another ghost that is seen in the house is the man in tails. This is a man in formal dress seen in various places around the house, including Samuel W. Peel's study. Many people believe that the ghost may be Colonel Peel himself. Several visitors have reported smelling cigar smoke while in his study. Another ghostly phenomenon that happens in the house is the appearance of childlike dusty footprints coming up from the basement of the house and into the foyer. But there have also been other spooky and unusual events in the Peel house.
Let me tell you one little ghost story, okay? In the early 1900s, after Colonel Sam sold the house, there was a family that bought it, and they had a set of twin daughters. Now, these twin daughters were characters. They loved to run around in their big overalls, and they loved to ride their pony out all over the yard. They gave their mother fits. Well, one day, one of the twins came in, and she's into the front parlor, and she started to tell her mother that she didn't feel well. Well, in the process, she just passed out right there on the floor. So they picked her up, took her upstairs, and laid her out, and they sent to Fayetteville for the doctor. Now, Mrs. English, who was the family living here at the time, the mother, she wanted the best for her daughter because she was frightened like any mother would be. So she brought the doctor up. When they arrived, he came with a nurse. They put her out on the bed in the master bedroom. Well, back in those days, you have to understand, they didn't have a lot of medication, practically nil, especially that they could give a child of about 12 years old. So they went ahead and they discovered that the whole problem was a ruptured appendix. So the doctor did surgery, the nurse assisted. But somewhere during the time of the surgery, when the doctor was busy, they discovered that Marjorie was no longer with us. She had passed on. So they reached down, they got the sheet, and they brought it up over her face, as we still do today. Then the doctor went outside to tell the family, and they sent word out to the community because that was long before there were telephones. So, and there certainly was an email. So they had to send word out into the community by a writer. Well, Mrs. English decided she wanted to go upstairs and have a private goodbye with her daughter. She went upstairs, and as she reached down to get the sheet to roll it back so she could lean down and kiss her, Marjorie's arm moved. She had not passed after all. She was just in a state of shock. Remember, they couldn't give her a heavy medication, so therefore she was just in a coma, kind of like a very deep sleep. Well, that happened a lot back in those days. So we're going to put Marjorie over here, and we'll get back to her in just a minute because I want to tell you another story. Back in those days, in the cemeteries, a lot of times they would bury people, but they would bury them, and they would put a long pole down through the casket, and on the end of that pole would be a bell. Now, the idea was, if you wake up and you're discovered you've been buried, you grab that bell and you start ringing like crazy, because they had patrols, as we would call them today, but they were night watchmen out in the cemetery listening for those bells. And that's where the term dead ringer came from. Now, back to Marjorie. Marjorie, it took her about 6 months to totally recover. She lived to be about 83 years old, and she had been here, as the Peel mentioned, many times. So that's our story.
The Allen House in Monticello is probably the most famous haunted house in Arkansas. It's been featured on the Sci-Fi Network, and there are 2 books written about the house's haunted history. There's currently a film in production about the house's hauntings, which will be filmed this winter. Between 1890 and 1910, Monticello was a booming town with lots of wealthy residents. One of those residents was Joe Lee Allen. Mr. Allen sold wagons and automobiles. He owned the Allen Hotel, a private school, and large tracts of timberland. Mr. Allen built the home we now call the Allen House between 1905 and 1906. Mr. Allen and his wife, Katie Allen, had 4 children: Lonnie Lee, Liddell, Walter Edwin, and Louis Manker. Walter died as an infant. In 1917, a tragedy struck the Allen family. Joe Lee Allen was outside of town on a test drive with an automobile for a potential customer when he died very suddenly. His body was brought back to the house, and the family laid him out in the dining room. His funeral was held there 2 days later, and he was buried in Oakland Cemetery in Monticello. Liddell Allen had a dramatic and unlucky love life. She met her first love, Prentice Hemingway Savage, as a teenager in Monticello. She dated him until 1913 when he left town. 1 year later, she married Boyd Randolph Bonner, who owned a billiard hall in Dumas, Arkansas. Exactly 1 year later, Liddell gave birth to her only child, Elliot Allen Bonner. By 1927, Liddell had divorced Boyd Bonner. As an adult, Liddell's son, Allen, moved to New York City, where he worked in the radio division of the Press Association. On January 12, 1944, Allen fell ill and was admitted to Gotham Hospital. 10 days later, he died of pneumonia. Just 8 months later, Liddell's sister Louie died from heart failure. On March 10, 1948, Liddell Allen Bonner went to the horse races in Hot Springs. She ran into her first love, Prentice Hemingway Savage. Within a week of their meeting, Prentice was writing letters to Liddell. Their correspondence turned into a love affair. In July, she spent 2 weeks traveling around Minnesota and Wisconsin with Prentice. He started the process of divorcing his wife, but something went wrong. By October, Prentice was still married and not with Liddell. In December, Prentice sent a final letter that implied he would not go through with the divorce. During her mother's Christmas party on the evening of December 25, 1948, Liddell Allen Bonner went to the master suite of the Allen house and consumed mercury cyanide. She died on January 2, 1949. Everyone in town knew that Liddell had committed suicide, but no one knew why. The house passed on to a grandchild who converted it into apartments. Ghost stories began to spread about the Allen house. One tenant, Carolyn Wilson, was so inspired by the reputation of her apartment house that she wrote a novel about it called The Scent of Lilacs, published in 1966. In 2007, Mark and Rebecca Spencer bought the Allen house. Mark Spencer says that one morning he woke with a compulsion to go to the attic. He didn't know why. It was impossible to ignore. He walked directly to a particular spot on the floor and stuck his hand under a floorboard, only to find a large envelope full of letters. He pulled the board up with a crowbar and found more packets of letters and a bottle of rum. There were 83 letters total, many of them love letters to Prentice Savage. The mystery of why Liddell committed suicide may be solved. However, this doesn't mean the house is any less haunted.
I'm Mark Spencer. I'm the owner of the Allen House. I'm also an author of several books, and I'm the Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities at the University of Arkansas at Monticello. The experience I'd like to share with you concerns the day that I found the letters in the Allen House attic. It was a hot Saturday morning in 2009. I woke up that morning immediately feeling the compulsion to go to the attic. I didn't understand why I needed to go to the attic, but it was like a voice in my head telling me that if I went to the attic, I was going to find something. I resisted the compulsion because I had other things to do that morning. But after I was up for about a half hour, I found myself going directly up to the attic and walking over to the edge of the turret room and looking down at an opening in the floor, a small opening of about 3 inches. I didn't really think too much of it. I had glanced down at that opening several times in the 2 years I'd lived in the house. And I really didn't understand why I was standing there looking at that opening. Finally, I got down on my knees to take a closer look into the opening, and I saw a piece of brown paper. My immediate thought was that it was old butcher paper. Then I thought, well, maybe it's old newspaper. I reached in, got a couple of fingers on the paper, pulled it out, and to my surprise, it was a large brown envelope. And inside that envelope were smaller white envelopes, and it was marked 1948, and they were all addressed to Liddell Allen Bonner. I pulled out one of the letters, and the salutation was dearest, and it was signed love, and then the initial P. And I realized, looking again at the envelope, which was postmarked October 1948, that I was looking at a love letter written to Liddell Allen Bonner 2 months before she committed suicide, 2 months before she took mercury cyanide poisoning during a Christmas party, Christmas night 1948. I thought that I was dreaming. I couldn't believe that this was reality, that I had actually found these letters. Once I realized that it wasn't a dream, that it was reality, I ran downstairs, got a claw hammer, went back upstairs, pulled up the floorboard, and there beneath the floorboard of the attic, I found approximately 90 letters pertaining to a relationship that Liddell Allen Bonner had with a man named Prentice Hemingway Savage throughout most of 1948. And these letters told the tragic story of their love affair and provided the motivation for Liddell's suicide, something that nobody understood for decades. Everybody was shocked and horrified when Liddell committed suicide at the end of 1948, but nobody understood why. With my discovery of the letters, we understood why. It had to do with the relationship that she had with Prentice.
Thank you.